Alright, so in 3D Studio Max I'm going to start off by creating a sky shader. Basically this is going to pull in my bitmap and I'm going to put the self-illumination up to 100, turn all the colors to black in the shader. So this is the same technique that we use over and over again in camera mapping. Get that self-illumination up to 100 and that way the rendering quality of our texture maps will appear exactly the same as it does in the map painting. No need for lighting or shadows. So the next step is to start building a model and get a camera in there. Judging by the photography in the plate, we're probably at around something like a 35mm lens. So we'll want to try and match that relatively close. I'm just going to lay down a big plane, and this is going to represent the plane at which the water resides. And the cube is going to be one of the first of many of some towers that we're going to create, some tall skyscrapers for the background. So I'm just going to load up the sky into my background so we can see it here in perspective. 1920 by 1080 is the canvas size for the matte painting and the plate. We don't want to consider the 2.35 aspect ratio just yet. We're just going to use the entire plate and see if we can get a CG camera to match the perspective of that plate. And then later on we can deal with the extraction issues that come with cropping things out to 235 or whatever aspect ratio you might need for your film. Now the next step is to just duplicate that ground plane, rotate it up, and this will act as our sky plane. This plane back here will catch not only the sky but the distant hillsides and maybe even some distant buildings down at the very bottom. We'll just try and scale it so that it fills the view left to right and top, and then the bottom can come down as low as our ground plane. Now since the camera path that I'm thinking of creating for the shot is pretty much just going to fly straight into the shot, the perimeter of the painting is really just going to start leaving frame, so we're not really going to have to worry about extending any of the painting. I'm going to duplicate this shader and call it foreground buildings, and then just load in my foreground buildings texture map and make sure the alpha channel settings of this are set correctly here in the diffuse color. Copy it to the opacity channel and change the alpha channel settings in here just so that it's cut out properly. Okay, so let's just make sure that we can see this shader, this texture in shaded mode. There it is on the card. It's just a little offset because it doesn't have our camera map modifier on it. This camera here is going to be our animated camera. And then I'll just create a second camera, and this will be our camera map camera. So we'll align it with the animated camera right now, this frame. So it shares the same properties, same position, and it's a 35mm. Okay, so let's just get a camera map modifier on this card. And we'll go into the render dialog box and make sure the aspect ratio is set to the same as our map painting, and we'll pick the camera, and we'll also pick the ground plane and pick the camera here so that we can start correctly projecting the texture on it as well. So in shaded mode everything seems to line up. Okay, so let's create a foreground buildings plane here. And we're going to want to try and position it to where we think those foreground buildings are going to end up in space. So if we take a look at, while we slide it around, let's watch the perspective view. We can see where the plane intersects the sky. As we bring it out, we'll want to pay attention to where the bottom of that yellow card is, and just try and get it to line up with where those foreground buildings hit the ground in the actual plate, the texture with the water there. So it looks like we need to push the sky back a little bit. Didn't leave enough room there for all of the city. So I'll push the sky back and scale it up. That should help us out in positioning the buildings correctly. Not just the cards, but the 3D building models as well. We'll get to creating those a little later. And just making some tweaks here, just trying to get the water to reach back to the sky plane now since we moved the sky. So the earlier we get this scene's relationships set up with regard to distance and scale, then the more success we're going to have ultimately in getting this scene to look realistic when we render it through the animated camera. Ultimately what we're trying to set up here is relationships in distance so that we get proper parallax. So we'll spend a little bit extra time here, make sure it's done correctly, and that way we can go on and concentrate on making it look realistic beyond that point. Notice the texture map here is being cut off. So if we increase the length and width, that's the proper way to adjust this. If we simply scale it like this, notice that it stretches the texture map. So make sure that you go underneath the camera map modifier and increase the length and width of the plane or whatever geometry that you have. And that way you won't have any stretching happening to your camera map modifier. So it looks like we have a little bit of a tiling issue in the front view. Won't really affect our render, but I'm just going to turn them off. It's good practice, just so that we don't have repeats. And also notice that the edge of the water here on the left and right is all it's all kind of meandering in and out. So I'm just going to up the number of polygons, go up to 50 in our plane. That should correct the flaw in the camera map modifier projection. So it should render cleaner here. There we go. I'm just going to go in and do the same thing to the sky plane. Increase the number of polygons on it, just so that we get a cleaner render. Now depending on your scene, you may or may not have to clean this stuff up. Really it depends. For example, in this scene, though the bottom of the water was a little bit rough, because we're going to crop the scene with the 235 crop, we are going to lose a lot of the bottom. But just because I did want to clean up the left and the right hand side of that water as well, I decided I should go and increase the number of polygons. Now I think this stuff down here is going to be outside my 235 region, so I'm just going to leave it for now. If I need to fix it, I can certainly come back and fix it later, but I really don't think I'm going to need to at all. So let's turn our attention to the skyscrapers in the shot. We're going to want to put those buildings on a card that is just behind the foreground buildings card. You have to determine how much distance is between the foreground buildings and these skyscrapers. So I'm just going to try and copy that plane, that foreground buildings, call it Hero. So it's named the same as my layer in Photoshop. And same with the shader, copy it, and then just start replacing the texture maps. Continuously copying these shaders and replacing their texture maps saves me a bit of time. I simply want them set up all the same with the same self-illumination and the same black values in their color and diffuse channels. So I just copy them. Makes things easier. So we'll follow the same steps over and over again. Apply the camera map modifier to this plane, render it out. So now we have the skyscrapers. Now let's try and move the animated camera in just a little bit let's see what type of parallax we might get, and what type of look will occur if we move that camera into the scene. Typically what I do is I work with the first frame and work with the last frame. At 24 frames a second, if we have a 100 frame shot, that's about a 4-second shot. So we just work with the two extremes. Push the camera in as close as we want to go and render it out. Take a look at the render. Go back to frame 1. I want to do it just a few times just to get a sense for how things change before you render out an entire scene, all 100 frames. So set up a little animation. Have the keyframe set for frame 1, and then at frame 100, I'm just going to take a guess and I'll try and keyframe it a little closer. Now notice the boats, especially the one at the bottom right. At frame 100, if we render it, it appears a little bit distorted. This is because the camera map is smearing it across the plane. Now, this is going to be outside of our 235 region, so again, we're not going to have to concern ourselves with this, because by frame 100, it will have... Now, since we have a rough model set up, now it's time to start experimenting with what we can do with our camera. We can grab the target, move it up and down, and we can grab the camera and move it back and forth, and just see what we see through the camera's eye. When you have the opportunity to create a 3D map painting and animate the camera, it's a great opportunity for doing a shot very efficiently. Because you're not tied down to a predetermined camera move, you can create a camera move that can minimize your efforts in modeling or in painting or whatever aspect you choose, so that you can concentrate on making the entire shot photoreal through whatever techniques that you're most skilled at. So if I render all 100 frames, I can show you what that looks like. I'll let that play, and then I'll scrub through it. We're starting to get a good sense of 3D space. If you scrub through it really quickly, you can see the broad strokes of what the camera's doing. And sometimes that helps to pick out any flaws. So if we were shooting this city from a real helicopter, we would probably have a little bit of a camera roll in there, just because there might be a little bit of a wind gust. Every now and then you might get some wind that offsets the camera. So I went ahead and animated a little bit of roll. Now let's turn our attention to the midground and the background buildings. So if we take these two layers and get them on some cards back here in the background, we can render this out now and see how it looks. Again, I'm just guessing to the placement of these cards, looking at the painting, trying to determine how far away they are away from the other buildings that we've established in 3D space. This is what the render looks like. You can see on the right and on the left, here and here, that we have these extra buildings added, and they have a nice amount of parallax in relationship to the foreground buildings and the sky. So I think that's working out quite well. Now, of course, since these foreground buildings are on the same texture map as our sky, we're going to have to go into our sky layer and remove those. We really just want to have the mountains and the sky established back in there. So as our camera moves through the scene, as these foreground buildings kind of come at us and move apart in parallax, we don't want to see the same exact buildings behind them projected on our sky card. So we'll do a little bit of underpainting. that I've come to solve these problems is to paint more than clone. As a beginner, it might be tempting to start cloning everything out, but you'll find that because of there's so much gradation happening here, cloning ends up looking quite blotchy. Now, you have to also determine how much you need to remove. I'm going to go in and try and remove as much as possible because through the years I've done enough of this that I feel I can do it moderately quickly. But if you're just starting out, you can use your 3D renderers as a guideline for what you need to remove and what you don't. Sometimes it might save you some time to just determine that you may only need to remove a small fraction of what you see here and not really have to get into removing everything you see on the horizon. Now, on that note, I am going to leave it a little bit rough. I'm not going to get it absolutely perfect at this point in time, just because I will render it and see if any of these blotchy areas, especially over on the left, come through in the final rendering. If not, great, I'll just go ahead and leave it. And if I need to, I can come back in and paint it quickly. But for the most part, all the buildings have disappeared, and we're only really left with what would probably be perceived as thick atmosphere. Sometimes in order to get a nice sharper mountain line back in the rear there, it's good to just go and trace a nice form with the lasso tool and start to cut out some of the darker mountain values or paint in some of the lighter sky values within the selection. Okay, so this is how the matte painting looks at this point in time. So it's time to get that new sky out into 3D Studio Max. And as well, I'll show you how to replace the foreground buildings texture and get the plate playing in it. What we want to do is we want to keep the opacity channel the same, but we're going to swap out this diffuse channel with the actual movie. So this is the plate here. Because our alpha channel is set in the opacity channel to cut out the foreground buildings and everything above it, including the sky, then all we'll have left is if there's any obvious flaws. Alright, so since we now have a good sense of 3D space in our 3D matte painting, let's get back to the matte painting in 2D and reevaluate some of the perspectives. In Photoshop to compare them against the horizontal lines within the plate, especially those taller buildings. It looked like they were pretty horizontal, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that as a cue to start tweaking some of these buildings in the skyscraper layer. Especially this one particular wall here. It seems to be falling back to a different vanishing point. So I'm just going to try and tweak him a little bit, just so it doesn't look like we're looking up at these skyscrapers quite so much. In the original photograph, maybe they were using a bit wider angled lens and they were a bit closer to these skyscrapers, so some of the view was a lot steeper than what we're implying it is here. So these are issues that you have to be sensitive to when you're using photographs from other shots, especially when they weren't shot intended for use in a particular plate. Now I'm just going to start scanning around the matte painting, looking for the most obvious problems to fix first. I've worked in the film industry for a number of years now, and the one thing that I've learned is as you're polishing up your matte painting, you really, I find it in my best interest to increase the quality to, finesse the map painting equally throughout and raise the quality of it consistently through the entire process. That way you don't run the risk of spending too much time perfecting one part of the map painting and running out of time not having the other parts of the map painting look as good or as real as they could have. So these particular buildings back in here, they appeared to need a little bit more haze based on the foreground buildings in front of them. I'm just going to go in and mat out some of this obvious garbage, the stuff that just isn't at the right scale. Some of the larger buildings in the rear there, they're acceptable, but there's some street lamps that were sticking up off of them. And since they were matted out very roughly in the beginning, there's quite a bit to clean up. So I'm not going to clean up everything. I'm just going to choose a few really obvious spots. I'm just going to clean this up so that maybe I can get it to look like there's this building has some type of exterior tower or exterior elevator shaft. Something a little unique. Again, maybe a little bit futuristic. Some of these edges over here that are against the sky, since they're a little higher contrast than other parts of the scene, you can get in there and try and clean that stuff up. Areas of high contrast generally tend to catch your attention first, so we want to make sure that the higher contrast areas don't really have any obvious flaws in them. This particular area here just looks like it needs to be flashed a little bit, so I'm just going to take the darker values up a little bit with curve until they pretty much match the rest of the building. It's kind of nice to keep the lights at the top of that one building there. Let's see if we can add a little bit of a haze or maybe some shadow to these foreground skyscrapers. I think areas with a little bit of darkness looks more appropriate. If we brush them in, we can start to give it a little bit more of a customized feel. Since there are some foreground buildings in front of these tall towers now, which there wasn't really in the initial shot, it makes sense to have a little bit of darkness down there in the canyons of the city. And this one part of the foreground building's layer needs to be adjusted. It has a lot of haze on it in the initial plate, and a little too much haze for this matte painting. Darken it down with the curve. Okay, so now let's see if we can increase the realism of some of these background buildings. They seem a little bit on the flat side. And let's correct some of the texture while we're in there. Scale the texture down a lot, just because we want it to recede back, just as the atmosphere is implying it is. Let's try and fix this building up here. It doesn't look believable, and it really just looks like a copy of the building that's closer off to the left with the slanted, that appears to have a slanted top. So we'll flatten out the texture so that it's more horizontal. And then let's see if we can give it a nice defined edge against the sky. And maybe let's put a little bit of sky between it and the building on the right. A little bit of breathing room. So that's starting to look a little bit better. Just steal some texture from that other building and scale it, position it. Try and make something else work here. And keep in mind I'm going to come back, I've already mentioned this, but just a reminder, I'm going to come back and I'm going to have some 3D models of buildings that I'm going to supplement the scene with. That'll give us a little more complexity back in behind these main towers. Sketching all these rear towers out in 2D in Photoshop and just trying to steal texture from other buildings isn't always the most efficient way to do things. It's quick, but the question is, how photorealistic is it in the end? Right now, because I am doing such a quick job, we have buildings that are, as a result, they feel a little bit plainer. So that's one of my goals, is to try and get things to look more 3D. And as a result, I think if we get in there with some 3D models, especially in clusters, each one of them might be shadowing each other a little bit. All in all, when we bring them in, when we merge them in with these other buildings, I think we'll get a lot more realistic and a lot more full look to the city. So back in 3D Studio Max, I'm just going to run through which texture is on each of the planes, and that'll help us determine between which two planes we want to place our 3D models that we're going to. They slightly resemble some of the skyscrapers on the planes that we've painted. So the next step is to just start moving them about, and in broad strokes just laying out generally where the massings would be. You can see here in blue the new buildings that I'm adding. And really overall what we're just going to do is we're going to try and supplement what we have in the background painting, in that texture map that's visible, with the cleaner, more perfect CG buildings. We'll just continue copying them until we get some nice clusters.